The sun was preparing to set on the horizon of the Aegean Sea, yet an unusual silence loomed over the streets of Milos. The wind howled as it struck the stone walls of the city, but the unease of the people overshadowed this natural melody. Cleon walked through the stone streets of Milos, the only place I had ever known, and saw a grey cloud of ash in the sky. The salty breeze coming from the sea had changed since yesterday. There was now a strange burnt scent in the air. My father, Aegisthos, was one of Milos's wise stone craftsmen. "This could be a sign of disaster," he had said during breakfast. Since then I had been carrying an unsettling feeling in my chest. As I approached the harbour, I saw people whispering anxiously. Some said the volcano in Thera was stirring, while others spoke of the wrath of the gods. But no one had left the island yet, and now I had a choice to make. As I made my way to the temple, an unsettling feeling grew in my chest. Were the gods truly angry? If so, something had to be done to appease them. Step by step, I climbed the white stone stairs of the temple. Inside it was dimly lit, with only a few torches burning. The priests were whispering among the columns. High Priest Menander noticed me, his expression filled with concern. "Cleon, we will not sleep tonight. The gods are whispering, but we cannot fully understand their message. Why have you come?" he asked. I told him about the unease at the harbour, the strange shift in the air and sea. The high priest nodded. "The gods have sent us a sign," he said, pointing toward a large bronze basin placed at the center of the temple. Inside, a mixture of oil and water swirled strangely. "This morning we saw the waves moving in the wrong direction. This could be a sign of disaster, but we do not yet know what kind of disaster it will be." One of the priests approached, holding a stick of burning incense. "If you wish to see, you may ask the gods for a sign yourself, but what you see may frighten you." I hurried down the stone steps of the temple, escaping the heavy scent of incense. As the priest's whispers faded behind me, a growing sense of panic pushed me forward. My father had always been a rational man, speaking not with gods and omens but with stones and the sky. If disaster was truly approaching, he would be the one to know. When I arrived home, I found him standing in the courtyard, his gaze fixed on the eastern sea. When he turned to me, his face carried an unfamiliar seriousness. "You're back, Cleon, just in time. We can't stay here any longer." His words hit me like a blow to the stomach. I had never heard him speak like this before. "Why, father?" "The priests at the temple also say something is wrong, but they don't know what." He shook his head and dropped the stone tablet he was holding onto the ground. "I do," he said. "This morning when I watched the sunrise, I noticed it. The air was too still. The wind was blowing in the wrong direction. But most importantly, the birds, they suddenly flew away from the cliffs. When was the last time you saw the birds leave Milos, sir?" A knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't remember. The sky here was always filled with birds. But today, there were none. "The volcano is going to erupt." My father narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. "The volcano on Thera will consume us soon. If we don't leave immediately, Milos will sink beneath the sea." It was hard to believe, but something inside me told me to trust him. Yet my mother, my younger brother, and the rest of our family were still here. Leaving everything behind wouldn't be easy. My father's eyes narrowed with worry. "We have no time to waste, Cleon," he said. But I wasn't at peace. My mother and my little brother Lysander were still inside. The thought of leaving them behind was like a storm churning in my stomach. "If we must leave, we must all go together," I said. My father clenched his teeth but finally nodded. "Be quick. If you can't convince them, we are leaving without them." I rushed inside. My mother was in the kitchen preparing what might be our last meal. My little brother Lysander played in the corner with his stone toys. "Mother, we must leave." She turned to me in surprise. "What? Cleon, what are you talking about?" I quickly explained everything. The ash in the sky, the birds fleeing, the priest's prophecy, and most importantly, my father's warning. My mother frowned. "Cleon, you're overreacting. We were born here. We grew up here. If the gods will, they will protect us." "No, mother, the gods may be warning us. If we stay, we will die," I said, my voice shaking. Lysander looked up at me with frightened eyes. My mother sighed. "Your father has always been a doomsayer." "Mother, please, if I'm wrong, we can return. But if I'm right, then it will be too late." She hesitated, but she had not made her decision yet. My brother remained silent, listening to us. I could see my mother hesitating, but deep down, she still didn't want to abandon our home. Logic alone wouldn't be enough to convince her, but if I could shake her faith, she might listen. "Mother, do you remember? Grandfather used to tell me the story of Helike when I was a child." She frowned. "What does that have to do with this?" The people of Helike also ignored the gods' warnings. When they heard strange sounds from the sea, they thought it was Poseidon's wrath, but they took no action. And what happened? Their city was swallowed by the ocean. Her eyes widened slightly, but she still wasn't convinced. "Cleon, Helike is a myth. Who knows if it was real?" "Then what about the prophecy from Delos? The priest said that when the wind from the sea blows the wrong way, disaster is near. That's exactly what's happening now. Father saw it, and even the temple priests are uneasy." Lysander clung to his sister. "Mother, I'm scared," he whispered. This time my mother's expression shifted. Her jaw tightened, and she glanced toward the door, eyes full of uncertainty. "Could your father really be right?" she murmured. "If he is, staying here means death," I said. She paused for a moment, then took a deep breath. All right, Cleon. Let's gather our things." My father stepped inside. "Finally, we must leave for the harbor immediately." I picked up Lysander in my arms and we ran outside together. But when we arrived at the harbor, we were met with an unexpected sight. People were panicking. Some were shouting and scrambling onto boats, while others were loading supplies and valuables. Armed men stood on the stone steps leading to the docks. Her voice rang out above the chaos. "If you want to board one of these ships, you must pay the price." The harbor was descending into madness. As we moved through the crowd, I grabbed my father's shoulder. "We can't get on those ships. We need another way." My father narrowed his eyes, then glanced toward the fishing boats further down the shore. Most were old, but a few looked seaworthy. If we could take one, we might escape unnoticed. "One of those boats will do," he said. "But we need to move quietly. If they see us, the men guarding the docks might stop us." My mother held Lysander tightly. "Are they even working?" she asked. My father nodded. "Some have oars. We can't risk raising a sail, but we can row out to sea." We started moving toward the shore, staying low behind the scattered rocks. Our eyes stayed on the men at the docks. Step by step, we crept forward. When we reached the boats, a few were already in the water. One looked sturdier than the rest, with some oars and ropes inside. This was our best chance, but there was a problem. The boat was tied to the shore, and we needed to free it. The men at the harbor hadn't noticed us yet, but time was running. Out I crouched behind the small rocks, holding my breath. I scanned the docks. Some of the men were busy loading people onto the ships, while others argued over payments. Was anyone watching us? I swept my eyes across the shore. No one seemed close by, but something felt off. My father whispered, "No one's looking. We need to cut the rope now." I pulled out my small dagger and reached for the thick rope. My mother nervously held Lysander close, while my father prepared to push the boat into the water. The blade sliced through the coarse fibers of the rope, making a faint sound. Just as I was about to cut it completely, a voice shouted behind us, "What do you think you're doing?" I turned to see 3 men rushing toward us. One of the dock guards had spotted our escape. He carried a wooden club and was heading straight for me. Our time was running out. "Get in the boat!" my father shouted, yanking the rope. The boat dropped into the water, rocking gently on the waves. But the men were getting closer. The men's footsteps pounded closer. Fighting wasn't an option. We had to survive for Lysander and my mother. I grabbed a handful of sand. As the men rushed toward us, I threw it with all my strength. Ah, damn it, my eyes. 2 of them stumbled back, rubbing their faces. That gave us just a second. "To the boat now," I yelled. My father, mother, and Lysander jumped in. I grabbed the last oar and leapt into the water. My feet were soaked as I pulled myself onto the wooden boards. By the time the men regained their sight, it was too late. The boat rocked on the waves as we started drifting away from the dock. My father and I rowed as fast as we could. The lights of the harbor grew dim behind us, but the men hadn't given up. Shouts rang out from the shore. Then, an arrow splashed into the water. "They have archers," my mother cried. Another arrow hit the side of the boat. If we stayed still, we would be shot. An arrow struck the wooden planks of the boat. "Get down," I shouted. Lysander curled into my mother's arms. My father and I let go of the oars and crouched low. Another arrow sliced through the air. I could hear the sharp sound of it hitting the water, but now that we were ducked inside the boat, the archers couldn't see their target clearly. "We should wait a moment," my father whispered. "If we move directly, we might be hit, but if we stay low, they may lose sight of us." Shouts echoed from the shore, but after a short while, the arrows stopped. The archers had lost their aim. "Now row," my father whispered. We grabbed the oars again, but this time instead of moving straight, we zigzagged. The archers tried to aim again, but our movements confused them. The boat drifted further from the docks. The open sea stretched before us. The voices on the shore faded. Now, only the sound of the waves remained. My father slowly released the oar and took a deep breath. "Did we make it?" my mother whispered. But just then the ground shook. From the middle of the sea, a deep rumbling sound rose from the ocean depths. My father's eyes widened. "The gods have not forgiven us." Behind us, a massive black cloud was rising over Thera. The volcano was erupting. Now our greatest problem was surviving the giant waves that were coming. My father's face was pale. My mother held Lysander tightly as we watched Thera spew black smoke into the sky. Then the first explosion rang out, a thunderous roar, but far more powerful, as if the world itself had cracked open. A few seconds later, we felt the earth shake. I turned back and saw fiery lava bursting into the sky. But the most terrifying sight was that the ocean was pulling away from the shore. My father gripped the oars. "A tsunami is coming! Row as fast as you can!" I didn't hesitate. I pulled the oars with all my strength. My father did the same, pushing us forward. The harbor disappeared behind us. Now before us lay nothing but endless open water, but the waves were rising higher and higher. And when I turned around, I saw the most terrifying sight of all, a wave as tall as a mountain. The tsunami created by Thera's eruption was rushing toward us. "Faster!" my father shouted. As the giant wave loomed on the horizon, I knew we couldn't outrun it. Rowing was useless now. "Drop the oars, tie yourselves down," I shouted. My father hesitated but moved quickly. My mother held Lysander tightly and sat in the center of the boat. I grabbed the ropes and tied my father, my mother, and myself securely to the wooden beams. We strapped Lysander tightly to my mother's arms. "No matter what, hold your breath," my father warned. "We might go under, but don't untie yourself." I nodded, and then the wave crashed down on us. The boat rose like a leaf. For an endless moment, we were hurled toward the sky. Then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, my mouth was filled with the salty taste of seawater. My face was wet. Coughing, I tried to stand. I was on a beach. My father, my mother, Lysander. I frantically looked around. A few meters away, my father lay unconscious. Further ahead, Lysander was crying. But my mother, she was nowhere to be seen. Deep fear rose inside me. Lysander's cries were barely audible over the roaring waves. I ran toward him. My little brother was sitting on the sand, shivering. His clothes were still soaked. I dropped to my knees and pulled him into my arms. "Lysander, are you okay?" "I'm here," I said. He clung to me, his breath shaky. "Where's Mom? Cleon?" he sobbed. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't know how to answer, but for now, we needed to survive. Taking a deep breath, I rushed to my father's side. My father's face was pale. I bent down to see if he was breathing. His chest rose and fell faintly. "Father, wake up." I shook his shoulder. He coughed, taking a deep breath, then opened his eyes. For a moment he seemed confused. Then his eyes focused on me and Lysander. "Cleon, did we survive?" he whispered. I nodded, but a sense of unease filled me. "Mom is missing, Father. I can't find her." He tried to sit up quickly, but winced in pain. His leg seemed injured. My father looked at me with a pale face. "Cleon, be careful," he said, but I was already on my feet. "I have to find Mom," I said, and sprinted along the shore. The waves were still crashing onto the beach. My feet sank into the sand as my eyes scanned every rock, every piece of driftwood, searching. Then I saw something. Ahead near the rocks, a human body lay motionless. "Mother!" I shouted, running forward. As I reached her, I couldn't see her face at first. She was covered in sand and seaweed. My hands trembled as I turned her over. And it was her. But her eyes were closed. She wasn't moving. A cold dread spread through me. My hands were shaking. "Mother, please wake up," I whispered. I quickly checked her pulse. I grabbed her wrist, but felt nothing. I touched her throat. A faint, barely there pulse, but she wasn't breathing. Fear spread through my veins like ice. "No, no, no." Then my father's voice echoed in my mind. "If someone drowns, you can press on their chest to force the water out." I dropped to my knees and laid her on her back. I placed my hands over her chest and pressed down. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I tilted her head slightly. "Come on, breathe." For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly she coughed violently, water spilling from her mouth. "Mother," I cried. She opened her eyes, pale and weak, but alive. "Cleon," she whispered, her voice frail. Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. "Yes, Mother, I'm here." She was shivering but breathing. We hadn't lost her, but we still had to get out of here. Where were we? Were we alone? My father and Lysander were waiting. I had to move her. My mother was still trembling. We couldn't stay here any longer. I bent down and lifted her onto my back. She was weak, but breathing. "Hold on, Mother. Father and Lysander are waiting," I said. She gave a faint nod. Her hands clung to my shoulders, but she had little strength. My feet sank into the sand with every step as I made my way back. The only sound was the waves. I just had to keep moving. And then, after a few minutes, I saw my father and Lysander. Father tried to stand but winced, his legs still injured. His eyes filled with tears when he saw my mother. "Is she alive?" he asked. I was out of breath but managed to smile. "Yes, she is." My father exhaled deeply, closing his eyes and lowering his head. "Thank the gods." Lysander ran toward us, yelling, "Mother, Mother!" I slowly set her down. Lysander grabbed her hands. Even in pain, my father pulled all of us into one embrace. "We made it," he whispered, but deep inside, something still felt wrong. We had survived. But where were we? Now we had to figure out how to stay alive. My father's injured leg and my mother's exhaustion meant we couldn't go far. "First, we needed to survive. We need to find food and water first," I said. My father nodded. "Tell me your plan, Cleon." "We'll split up," I said. "Lysander and I will go into the forest to search for food and water. Father, you stay here and protect Mother. Also check the shore for other survivors." My father hesitated. "Going into the forest alone could be dangerous. Lysander will be with me. He's small but fast and careful. If we see anything dangerous, we'll return immediately." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But be careful. If anything goes wrong, come back immediately. You should try to set up camp here," I said. "We might have to spend the night outside." My father used a wooden plank to dig into the sand. "I'll try to make some kind of shelter." "All right, we're going now," I said. Lysander and I started walking toward the forest. As we stepped into the trees, I felt both excitement and fear. Lysander looked around curiously. "What kind of animals do you think live here?" he whispered. "I don't know, but we need to be careful," I said. The forest was humid. Aside from the crunching of dry leaves under our feet, everything was silent. After about half an hour, we found a small stream. "Water!" Lysander shouted. The water looked clear, but we didn't know if it was safe to drink. Near the stream there were some fruit trees. The branches held ripe-looking fruit that I didn't recognize. I saw Lysander eyeing the water with thirst, but drinking from an unknown source could be dangerous. "Wait, Lysander. Let's take this water back to camp and boil it first," I said. My little brother frowned but nodded. "Okay, but I'm really thirsty." We found some large leaves and used them along with our small containers to collect the water. For now it looked clean. Then I noticed the fruit trees. Some of the fruits were bright orange, while others were small, red and grape-like. I didn't know which ones were safe to eat. Carefully I picked a few of them. We shouldn't eat them without asking my father. Let's go back to camp, I said. By the time we returned from the forest, the sun was beginning to set. When we reached the camp, my father was building a simple shelter out of sand and sticks. "You're back?" he asked. "Are you both all right?" "Yes." "We found water and fruit," I said. My father examined the water carefully. "We won't drink it until we boil it. We need to make a fire." He took the fruits and inspected them one by one. His expression grew serious. "Don't eat the orange ones, they might be poisonous. But these red ones, they look like small berries. If we try them, we should eat only a tiny piece first." My mother, who was now slightly rested, spoke. "How will we make fire?" My father sat down, thoughtful. "If we rub stones against a hard surface, we might get sparks, but we'll need dry leaves." Within minutes, we started preparing the camp. My father held 2 sharp stones in his hands. "Cleon, do you want to try?" he asked. "If we can make a spark, we can light the dry leaves," I nodded. "Yes, I'll do it." We set up a small pile of dry leaves and twigs in front of me. I took the stones and struck them together. Tack, tack. Nothing happened. I tried again, this time rubbing the stones harder before striking. A tiny spark flickered. Lysander leaned in, excitedly. "Did we make fire?" My father nodded patiently. "Keep going, Cleon. Try to land the sparks on the leaves." After several attempts, a spark landed on the dry leaves and smoldered faintly. My father leaned in and gently blew on it. Suddenly, a thin wisp of smoke curled upward. Then a small flame appeared. "We did it," my mother whispered. Lysander jumped with joy. "Fire, fire!" But there was no time to celebrate. We had to keep it burning through the night. My father carefully added small twigs. The fire was our only warmth until sunrise. Yet, I still wasn't at ease. Were there any other survivors on the beach? Once I was sure the fire was safe, I turned to my father. "I'll check the shore for any other survivors." He frowned but nodded. "Don't go far. It's getting dark." The glow of the fire faded behind me as I walked along the shore. Everything was silent except for the waves. As my feet sank into the sand, I saw something move in the distance. A shadow shifted in the darkness. Was someone there? My heart pounded. That shadow. I had seen it move, but I didn't want to take a risk alone at night. I needed to go back and tell my father. I stepped back carefully, making sure not to sink too deep into the sand. I kept my eyes on the shadow as I moved away. Then the shadow disappeared. Swallowing hard, I ran back to the camp. As soon as I felt the warmth of the fire, I let out a deep breath. My father sat up immediately. "What happened? You look pale." "Father." "Someone was on the beach," I said, breathing heavily. "Or something." My father frowned. "Are you sure?" "Could it have been a reflection from the waves?" I shook my head. "No, it moved like a shadow, then it was gone." My father was silent for a few moments. "If someone is out there, we need to know who they are." My mother spoke anxiously. "What? If they're dangerous?" My father quietly grabbed a wooden staff. "There's only one way to find out." My father gripped his staff tightly, his face shadowed by the firelight. "If someone really is on the beach, leaving the camp will make us vulnerable." He said. I nodded. "But we can't ignore it completely. Maybe it was someone who needed help. Or maybe it was something watching us." My father thought for a moment, then sat by the fire. "We'll take turns keeping watch tonight." My mother frowned. "But we're exhausted. Can we handle that?" My father nodded. "Cleon is right. If someone is out there, we need to be careful. The watch plan, I will take the first watch. My father needs to rest because of his injured leg. My father will take over after me. My mother and Lysander will sleep." Everyone agreed. Lysander, reluctantly, closed his eyes. I sat by the fire, staring into the darkness. Hours passed. The fire crackled softly as I kept my eyes on the beach. At first, there was nothing. Then, a sound. Footsteps? The waves? I listened closely. In the distance, something moved along the shoreline, but in the darkness, I couldn't tell what it was. Was someone really there? The faint firelight flickered against the waves. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still. The night's cold pressed against my skin, But I didn't let my focus waver. Was something really there, or was my mind playing tricks on me? Minutes passed. The shadows on the beach remained still. Finally, a wave of relief washed over me. Maybe there really was nothing. I took a deep breath and continued my watch. Nothing else happened that night. Before dawn, my father woke up and took over the watch. As the sun rose, everyone slowly stirred. Lysander stretched. "We're still here," he mumbled. My father looked toward the sea. "Did you see anything strange last night?" I explained what had happened. "I thought I saw a shadow, but it never moved. Then nothing happened." My father frowned. If someone really was there, they're either hiding from us or watching us. We had to decide what to do today. As the first morning light shimmered over the sea, my father and I decided to walk along the shore. My mother and Lysander stayed behind to tend the fire. "If anything dangerous happens, come back immediately," my mother warned. My father gripped his staff tightly. "We'll be careful," he said. Slowly, we began our walk along the coastline. For a while we walked in silence. The shadows of the night were gone. Then I noticed something in the sand. "Father, look at this," I whispered. "Small footprints, human-like. But no one else should have been here." My father crouched and examined the tracks. "Did someone come here before us?" he murmured. The footprints led further down the shore, and ahead something shiny was half buried in the sand. "There's something there," I said. My father nodded. "Be careful, Cleon. This could be a trap." As my father kept watch, I walked toward the shining object in the sand. The footprints led here, but strangely they stopped abruptly. That was unusual. If someone had been here, where did they go? I bent down and picked up the object. As soon as I touched it, I recognized the cold feel of metal. It was a medallion. It had an old symbol engraved on it, a circular shape with wavy lines in the center. My father stepped beside me. "This looks like a symbol of a god," he said. I turned the medallion over. There was a strange inscription on the back, but one thing was clear. We were not the first people to step on this land. My father stared at the medallion for a long moment. "There may have been people here before us," he said. I nodded. "But why did the footprints suddenly disappear? Is someone still here, or is this just a remnant of the past?" My father gazed into the distance thoughtfully. My father and I focused on where the footprints had suddenly vanished. How was that possible? If someone had walked here, they couldn't have just disappeared. My father planted his staff into the ground. "Could this be a trap?" he murmured. I crouched down carefully. I started digging through the sand with my hands. And then I noticed something. Just beneath the sand, there was a hard stone surface. But this stone was smooth. It wasn't natural rock. My father looked at me. This could be man-made. Looking closer, I saw a gap between the stones beneath the sand. Could this be a door or an entrance? My father and I kept digging carefully, and finally, a small stone staircase emerged. It led downward, into what looked like an ancient passage. My father rested his hands on his knees. "This could be an underground structure," he said. Excitement and fear filled my chest. If this was a shelter, someone might be inside. But if it was abandoned, what secrets did it hold? My father took a deep breath. "What do we do, Cleon?" My father stood at the top of the stairs, staring down. "We shouldn't go in yet," I said. "We don't know what's inside. There could be someone or even a trap." My father nodded. "You're right, we need to understand this place first." We examined it more closely. The stairs were partially covered in sand and stone. Inside was completely dark. No sound came from below. Along the staircase, strange symbols were carved into the stone. My father ran his fingers over the symbols. "This is an ancient structure," he said. "It could be hundreds of years old." The carvings resembled depictions of gods, but some didn't look like any gods we knew, my father whispered. "This civilization might be different from what we know. If this was a temple or a shelter, who knew what was inside?" my father thought. "We could stay one more night and explore this place in the morning," he suggested. My father and I exchanged glances. Before we leave, we need to do something, I said. My father nodded. If someone is coming here, we must know. We decided to set up simple but effective traps and markers. We piled dry twigs and small stones in front of the entrance. If someone entered, they couldn't pass without disturbing them. We made a few markings in the sand nearby. If the patterns changed, we'd know there was movement. We took a small stone and placed it on the lowest step of the entrance. If it was knocked over, someone had gone inside. When my father finished, he took a deep breath. "All right, let's head back to camp," he said. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the entrance. "If someone comes here, we'll know by morning." As we walked back, I felt uneasy. Something about this land made me feel like we weren't alone, but still our safest place was camp. When we arrived, my mother immediately stood up. "Where were you? You took so long." My father showed her the medallion. "We found that, and more importantly, we discovered an underground structure." My mother's eyes widened. "A structure?" My father nodded. "We're going back in the morning, but first we need to rest." Lysander ran up to us. "Are you taking me with you?" he asked eagerly. Lysander looked at me eagerly. "Please take me with you. I want to explore too." I smiled but shook my head. "No, Lysander, it may not be safe." Lysander's face fell. "But I can help." My father placed a hand on his shoulder. "We need someone to stay and keep the fire going. We also need food." Lysander sighed and looked at the ground. "Okay." I knelt down to his level. "This is important. Lysander, if you help from here, you're doing something just as important as us." He thought for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll protect the camp." Our mother would stay with Lysander, keeping the camp safe while we explored. My father and I prepared for the next morning. We packed a small water skin, limited supply, a small dagger for defense, a stone flint to make fire, thin ropes and cloth, strips for tying or marking our path, some dried fruit and meat for energy. My father stretched. "All right, we're ready." "At sunrise we leave," I said. We sat by the fire and spent the night in silence. Nothing strange happened until dawn, but deep inside I felt the weight of the mystery ahead. Tomorrow we would step into the unknown. When morning came, my father and I were ready. We said goodbye to Lysander and my mother. "Be careful," my mother warned. My father nodded. "If we don't return by midday, don't leave the camp." After hours of walking, we reached the stone staircase once again. We checked the area. Our traps were still in place. But the small stone we left on the bottom step was moved. My father gripped his staff tightly. "Someone was here." "Did they go inside?" I whispered. My father took a deep breath. "There's only one way to find out. We have to go in." And we stepped into the darkness. The air inside was cold. I ran my hand along the stone walls. They were damp and rough. At first the passage was narrow, but as we walked further it widened. Then I saw something ahead, on the ground. Human bones. My father stopped. "This is not good," he muttered. My father stood cautiously. "Be careful, Cleon," he whispered. I knelt and examined the bones. The first thing I noticed was how old they were. They had cracks and wear marks. Some were darkened, as if burned in fire. One of the skulls was shattered. But the strangest part was how some bones were cleanly cut. They looked like they had been severed with a sharp tool. This wasn't a natural death. My father crouched and picked up a bone. "These might have been sacrifices." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" He frowned. "If this was once a temple, there might have been human sacrifices here." Hearing that made my throat tighten. If these bones belonged to a sacrifice, then who were the worshippers? Suddenly, from deep inside the tunnel, a faint whisper echoed. My father and I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. My father nodded. "Yes. But I don't know if it was human." My father and I locked eyes. "We shouldn't move yet," I whispered. "We need to understand where this sound is coming from first." My father nodded and we crouched silently. The whisper-like sound from deep inside the tunnel came and went, fading in and out. But it didn't sound entirely human. At times it was like the wind howling, but other times it almost formed words. "But," I couldn't recognize the language. I listened more carefully. The sound echoed. It wasn't close, it was coming from far away. My father leaned toward me. "This sounds like a prayer chant," he whispered. My eyes widened. "What do you mean?" My father touched the stone wall. "If this was once a temple, maybe its priests used to chant this. But could someone still be doing it?" A lump formed in my throat. "You mean this place is still in use?" My father's expression darkened. "We don't know. But if it is, we might be in danger. We couldn't wait much longer." I placed a hand on my father's shoulder. "Let's retreat and observe," I whispered. "If someone is inside, we need to see them before they see us." My father nodded. "You're right. We shouldn't rush." Silently, we moved back toward the entrance. Since we hadn't lit a fire, our eyes were adjusting to the darkness. We found a good hiding spot near the entrance and began to watch carefully. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. The sound from within still echoed, but it was now fainter. My father whispered, "Maybe it's just a natural phenomenon, an old wind tunnel." But just then something made my skin crawl. A light flickered deep inside the tunnel, for just a second, and then it vanished. My father held his breath. "Did you see that?" I nodded. "Yes. A light, a torch. If there was fire inside, it meant someone was there." My father gripped his staff tightly. "What now, Cleon? This could be the most important choice we had made so far. It seemed like someone was inside. But who were they? And were they friend or foe?" I looked into my father's eyes. "We can't turn back. If someone is inside, we need to know who they are." My father took a deep breath and nodded. "Then we must be very quiet. If it's a trap, we can't let them notice us." He gripped his staff tightly. I held my small dagger as we moved silently, deeper into the tunnel. Darkness swallowed us. The ceiling lowered, the air grew cold and damp, but ahead a faint flickering light shimmered in the deep blackness. This was definitely fire. Someone had lit it. We stepped forward carefully. Aside from the soft echo of our footsteps, the tunnel was completely silent. Finally, we reached a widening in the passage. Before us stood an old stone doorway. From the small gap in the doorway, the flickering light spilled into the tunnel. My father raised his hand. "Someone might be inside," he whispered. We moved closer and peered through the opening. What we saw sent shivers down our spines. Inside was a large, ancient stone chamber, and in the center, someone was sitting on the floor. Their back was turned to us. A small torch flickered in front of them, and they were writing something with their hands, but the strangest thing was, they wore a strange priest-like robe. "Who was this person?" my father whispered. "What if he notices us?" I touched my father's shoulder. "Waiting won't give us answers. We need to find out who he is." My father frowned, but then nodded. "All right. But be careful. If he's dangerous, we back off immediately." Slowly, I stepped past the doorway. The man was still sitting, scraping something onto the stone floor. I could hear his breathing. As we took a few steps inside, my father spoke in a deep voice. "Who are you?" The man froze. The stone tool in his hand fell and echoed in the chamber. Then slowly he turned his head. His face was thin and pale. His beard was long and unkempt, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. But the strangest thing, I couldn't understand his words. At first he spoke in a hoarse, whispering tone. "Anunnaki, Sira, Xipnima." My father immediately stepped back. "I know this language." My eyes widened. "What? How?" my father whispered. "It's an ancient tongue. It appears in the oldest myths of Milos. It sounds like the language of lost priests." The man stared at us as if he hadn't seen another human in a long time. Then his eyes locked onto the medallion in my father's hand. His expression changed instantly. "Pos tovrikateavto." My father narrowed his eyes. "Tell us, what is this place?" The man hesitated. Then he took a deep breath and whispered, "This is the tomb of the forgotten." The man was shaking but not afraid of us. Instead, it seemed like he had been alone for a long time and was shocked by our arrival. But calling this place the tomb of the forgotten made me uneasy. The man's words sent a strange feeling through me. The tomb of the forgotten. My father leaned in slightly. "What happened here? Who are you?" he asked. The man, still fixated on the medallion, whispered, "I was once a priest." I stiffened. "Was this place a temple?" He nodded. "Yes, but not anymore. Now, it is a tomb." My father's voice turned sharp. "Whose tomb?" The man took a deep breath. "A great people once lived here. They read the stars, spoke to the gods, but one day they made a mistake." "What mistake?" I asked. The man hesitated, as if struggling to find the words. Then, with his finger, he drew an ancient symbol in the dust, a serpent coiling around the sun. "They woke the old gods." My father narrowed his eyes. "Gods? That's just a legend, isn't it?" The man didn't smile. "I wish it were. But gods do not die, they only sleep, and the people here, they woke them." A chill ran down my spine. "And what happened next?" I whispered. The man lowered his gaze. "They punished the people. First, the sea rose, then came sickness, and finally, the sky turned black." My father frowned. "Was this a natural disaster?" The man slowly nodded. "I don't know. But one morning, when we awoke, everything had changed. And in time, no one was left." "But you're still alive," I said. "Why are you here?" The man smiled, but there was sorrow in it. "I am the last guardian, the final priest of this temple. I watch over its secrets, and I keep an eye on the sleepers." What he had told us was unbelievable. If it was true, this land had once been home to a great people, but they had been wiped out by some unknown catastrophe. But who were the sleepers? My father watched me carefully. "Cleon, what do we do?" I looked into the man's eyes. "Who are the sleepers? What are they?" The man took a deep breath. "They were the servants of the gods." My father frowned. "Servants?" The man nodded. "They were not like us, but the gods gave them commands and they built this temple. As the people of Milos grew wiser, these beings were forgotten and they fell into sleep." "Where do they sleep?" I asked. The man slowly tapped the ground. "Deep beneath this temple, they wait in the dark." A chill ran down my spine. My father spoke firmly. "If they're asleep, why should we be afraid?" The man lowered his head. "Because if you disturb them, they will wake again." A dark feeling crept over me. "Has anyone else come here? Has there been any movement?" The man remained silent. Then he lifted his head. "Yes. Before you arrived, someone else came." My father stepped forward. "Who? Who came here?" The man narrowed his eyes. "Outsiders. They were not from Milos." "What did they do?" I asked. The man looked down. "They tried to break the seals." My chest tightened. "Seals? What did you seal?" The man bit his lip. "The chambers of the sleepers. They have been locked away for thousands of years." But his eyes widened in fear. "If the seals are broken, this world will never be the same again." My father turned to me. "Cleon, we've learned this much, but we need to decide our next step." I touched my father's arm. "We need to share this with Mother and Lysander," I said. "If danger is coming, we must be prepared." My father nodded. "You're right. What we've learned is too important." I turned to the priest. "We'll return. But if you remember anything else or notice something changing, you must tell us." The man nodded, but his face was filled with deep fear. "Time is running out," he whispered. "If the seals are broken, everything will change." Those words echoed in my mind as we quietly retreated from the tunnel, silent, cautious. By the time we reached the entrance, the morning sun had risen. We had spent almost the entire night inside. My father turned back for one last look at the tunnel. "This place is a graveyard of secrets," he said, "but secrets never stay buried forever." As we walked back, Lysander spotted us from a distance and ran toward us. "You're back! It took so long." My mother rushed forward. "Are you all right? What happened?" My father took a deep breath and said, "Sit down, there's much to tell." We sat around the fire and told them everything we had learned, that this place was once a temple, What the priest said about the sleepers, the danger of the broken seals, that someone had been there before us. My mother frowned. If what he says is true, then this place is dangerous. Lysander leaned forward excitedly. So what do we do now? That was the biggest question. My mother spoke first. We should leave this place. We can't stay in the middle of this danger. My father was quiet. If the sleepers truly wake, it won't just be this place at risk. It could change everything. Lysander, however, was eager. We should explore the temple more. There's more to learn. As we sat around the fire, my mother's words sank deep into me. This place is dangerous. My father was thinking. Lysander wanted to explore, but all I could think about was survival. I took a deep breath and spoke. We have to leave. This risk is too great. My father turned to me, silent for a moment. Then he nodded. If the seals are truly breaking, this place may no longer be safe. Lysander protested. But we need to learn more. My father raised his hand. Survival is more important than knowledge, Lysander. If we return, it will be when we are stronger. My mother let out a sigh of relief. Then we must start preparing. Looked around. We had a few days' worth of food, but we needed more. What we needed to do, gather enough water and food, check our weapons and tools, decide where to go. My father looked at the shore. If we follow the coastline, we may find another settlement. I nodded. Where we're going is unknown, but staying here is an even greater risk. Then we leave at first light, my father said. That night we sat silently by the fire. Everyone was lost in thought. My father kept murmuring, should we return one day? Lysander still tried to convince us to stay, and I only thought about surviving. As the wind whispered through the trees, I drifted between sleep and wakefulness. At sunrise, we put out the fire and made our final preparations. I turned for one last look at the mountain where the temple lay. Was something truly sleeping there? I didn't know. But sometimes survival means walking away from answers, and so we stepped forward into the unknown.